Bangladesh is a country of immense opportunity, which could easily become one of the largest industrial powers in Southeast Asia, but to understand what it would need to do to make that a reality in the future, and what has held it back in the past, it should have made Bangladesh a much more successful economy than it currently is.
बांग्लादेश की कामयाबियों को देखते हुए आलमी माहिरीन का ये कहना है कि बांग्लादेश की जो तरक्की का लेवल है वो चीन से भी ज्यादा है। चीन की तरक्की से भी ज्यादा तेजी के साथ बांग्लादेश तरक्की कर रहा है और आने वाले टाइम के अंदर बांग्लादेश चीन नहीं बल्कि चीन से भी बड़ी मईशत बनाने जा रहा है गारमेंट के अंदर। और 2024 के अंदर 2023 के अंदर ये जो डाटा कलेक्ट किया गया है इसके मुताबिक चीन से ज्यादा बांग्लादेश ने एक्सपोर्ट की है। तो ये बड़े आंकड़े हैं, बड़े माहिरीन हैं, ये दावा कर रहे हैं कि आने वाले चंद सालों में बांग्लादेश चीन को भी बीट कर जाएगा और चीन से भी बड़ी मईशत बन जाएगा गारमेंट के अंदर। और जहां तक चीन अपनी प्रोडक्ट को नहीं पहुंचा सका, बांग्लादेश ने वहां तक अपनी प्रोडक्ट पहुंचाकर कामयाबी के झंडे गाड़े हैं। तो आलमी माहिरीन किस तरह दावा कर रहे हैं बांग्लादेश की कामयाबी को लेकर, तो आज इसी हवाले से वीडियो है। वीडियो की तरफ बढ़ने से पहले आप दोस्तों से गुजारिश है, अगर आप चैनल पर नए हैं तो चैनल को सब्सक्राइब करें, साथ बने बेल आइकॉन को भी दबाएं ताकि आपको वीडियो का नोटिफिकेशन सबसे पहले मिलता रहे। चलें वीडियो शुरू करते हैं जी। 1 2 3 go.
Bangladesh is a country that tragically should be much more successful than it is. It has a lot of the advantages that could have made it a rapidly developing economy. Global trade routes, a low debt to GDP ratio, access to oil, and a dense population. It even adopted the Westminster legal system, something that is loved by international investors and recognised worldwide for conducting business fairly. It had everything in place to be an economic powerhouse in a rapidly developing region, but yet, it isn't. Despite all of these advantages, it's still on the UN's least developed country list. Bangladesh is a country of immense opportunity, which could easily become one of the largest industrial powers in Southeast Asia, but to understand what it would need to do to make that a reality in the future, and what has held it back in the past, we must as always answer a few simple questions. So, what were the factors that should have made Bangladesh a much more successful economy than it currently is? How did Bangladesh miss these opportunities? And is there anything it can do to turn this around and live up to its potential? After we've done all of that, we can put Bangladesh on the Economics Explained leaderboard. In the last few years, the idea of working from home has gone from a dream to a daily reality for a lot of white-collar workers. But it's a definite struggle to stay productive at home when you have so many distractions just a click away. I mean, I accidentally click on YouTube and that's it. Down a rabbit hole about how to build my ideal gaming setup, which as it exists today really got started in 1971 after one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. The Bowler cyclone hit the region in November 1970, killing an estimated 500,000 people. Before that, Bangladesh was known as East Pakistan, a cut-off region divided by India that existed like this for nearly 25 years before its eventual independence. Colonial England was kicked out of what was then colonial India, forming the boundaries of West Pakistan and East Pakistan in 1947. By haphazardly drawing up those borders, the British ended up dividing political control in the West, and the people in the East were not happy about this. Starting in 1970s, tensions were high, and talks of independence were brought to a head when one of the single deadliest natural disasters in modern history, the Bowler cyclone, hit in November of 1970, killing an estimated 500,000 people in the East. That's 4 Hiroshimas that happened over the course of just 6 days. The government in the West failed to bring relief, and people in the East felt angry and left to strike out on their own. On top of the casualties from the cyclone, a lot of people died in the struggle for the country's independence, which was fought out over 9 months from March to November of 1971. At the same time, India was fighting with Pakistan, while the war for independence between East Pakistan and West Pakistan was going on, and this in and of itself became a proxy for the Cold War. The world superpowers at the time, the US and the Soviet Union, were vying for control and influence in the region, and these conflicts were a catalyst for a lot of global tensions. The US didn't want to get involved in the Indo-Pakistan conflict because Pakistan was an ally of China. Meanwhile, between the time East Pakistan declared itself the independent nation of Bangladesh and the time it was actually recognised as an independent nation, India signed a friendship treaty with the Soviet Union, who pledged their support for East Pakistan. And so the two world superpowers found themselves on opposing sides of the Indo-Pakistan War, with the Bangladesh Liberation War happening as well, nearly igniting tensions to the highest point in the Cold War. The conditions on the ground in Bangladesh at this time were so bad that the average life expectancy dropped noticeably over just the span of 2 years surrounding its push for independence. Starting a new country is never easy, but starting one under these kinds of conditions meant that Bangladesh was almost doomed to fail from the beginning. There was a rapid onset of a natural disaster followed by a civil war and the death and devastation that both left in their wake, plus a regional conflict with potential global consequences of nuclear weapons, and this all happened in the first year of Bangladesh's existence. Now, it wasn't all bad, and since then, conditions in and opportunities for the country have improved significantly, even if it's still bearing the scars to this day. Bangladesh boasts several strong economic characteristics, including access to global trade routes, a low debt to GDP ratio, access to oil, and a dense population, so even with its tragic history, it could have been a major regional power. But beyond just the rough start, there are more foundational problems that stand in its way. When a country is a low-cost exporter, it's usually because that country has a comparative advantage in producing items as cheaply as possible. Comparative advantage simply means that one national or state economy or economic system can produce more of one particular output for the same amount of given inputs. Inputs can be labour, how much manpower is it going to take and how much are those hours worth, or materials, how efficiently can an economy turn steel into cars, or even time, how quickly can an economy produce a given good or service. A country might very well be able to produce something like a smartphone more efficiently than China or South Korea, but if it takes them decades to make enough to meet consumer demand, they're still going to be less desirable manufacturing hubs than these established economies. This is particularly important for Bangladesh. Of course, most commonly, all of these variables are simply considered together with the sole input being money. For example, how much money is it going to cost to produce 1 million units of a television? Whatever country can do it for less has the comparative advantage. Altogether, the weight of these inputs gives certain countries a comparative advantage producing certain goods and services, but no country has a comparative advantage in absolutely everything. China, for example, has fantastic export infrastructure, relatively low wages by global standards, and a government that's amenable to let industries do what they want with very little oversight for things such as environmental regulations. They also have large economies of scale with a huge population, widespread industrial know-how, and a tight geographic concentration of other manufacturers for component parts, allowing them to get really good at producing low-cost consumer goods and develop a reputation for doing just that. They can produce something like a toaster with less total inputs than an economy like the USA would, not only because their workers demand lower wages, but also because other manufacturing expenses are cheaper within China. But that's okay, because the USA, for example, has the comparative advantage in engineering and technical development. Well, most of the time. Because they have a financial system that really incentivises capital investment for research and development, and a market that encourages entrepreneurship. It motivates people to get out and develop new technologies and new products that can be exported around the world, paying very high salaries and attracting talented people at the top end. And this gives the USA a comparative advantage in producing advanced services and technical development, medicines and pharmaceuticals, as well as the technology that a country like China is just better at manufacturing. So the comparative advantages of China versus the comparative advantages of the USA are different. Now, Bangladesh's comparative advantage today is in textiles. And why is that? Well, textiles are very, very cheap. Garments and goods like that are very labour intensive, so it's hard to automate the production of a t-shirt where there are different sizes. It's so difficult to automate that even a technologically superior economy like China, which is right next door, can't compete because it's so manpower intensive. The comparative advantage here is with the country that has the largest supply of really cheap manpower, and that's Bangladesh. This is okay for now, but if Bangladesh wants to make the transition from a least developed country to a middle-income country, it's going to need to transition from a labour-intensive economy to a capital-intensive one. This shift is important because capital-intensive economies need to attract foreign investment. A country like the US has the highest concentration of capital investment in the world because it's really where people go to invest their money. But most of what Bangladesh exports is our shirts and our garments because they're also labour-intensive to produce, and no country can become advanced by exporting t-shirts, so they need to transition to other capital-intensive activities so they can start to gain a comparative advantage in other things. Unfortunately, South Asia is a region with a lot of competition, and the trade agreements that make it a low-cost exporter as a least developed country all but disappear once it becomes a middle-income country. So then, why is it important to make this shift? Well, an economy that is open to trade and investment with the rest of the world is important for sustained GDP growth, and Bangladesh has all of the ingredients to grow. Access to global trade routes, being a low-cost exporter, and unrealised export diversification in both goods and trade partners. If a country doesn't diversify its exports enough to grow, it could result in a trade deficit, which is when a country's imports are in excess of its exports. It also leaves a country more vulnerable to external shocks or unexpected events that impact an economy like the COVID-19 pandemic or the current crop of global conflicts. And when Bangladesh has a trade deficit with one of the countries it imports from, it has to borrow the difference, which leads it to rely on external development financing, for example, from the International Monetary Fund or the IMF, to fix it. But Bangladesh has mostly avoided this for now because it does have one other surprising financial trick up its sleeve here: remittances, which is the earnings of foreign currency that external migrants send back to their home country. Beyond just being a source of revenue to keep paying for all those extra imports, this flow of foreign currencies adds a layer of stability to its foreign exchange reserves. Having enough foreign exchange reserves also helps a country maintain a stable foreign exchange rate, which boosts confidence in its economy. Most low-income countries like Bangladesh heavily rely on remittances, especially because the money received from someone working abroad is most, if not the only source of income for a household, which affects how much money people in that household spend on goods and services in Bangladesh, which contributes to its GDP growth. Measuring all of these economic indicators accurately is crucial for any country, and while most advanced economies have reliable and timely data used by policymakers and economists to make decisions, this is one of the pain points for Bangladesh. So much so that it has not been able to develop a credible statistical system and instead issues data full of inaccuracies and anomalies. And in developing countries, there is a high potential for it to succumb to political pressure by ruling parties by way of data manipulation to serve a larger agenda. The authenticity of GDP numbers released by the Bangladeshi Bureau of Statistics has been questioned, and then there's lack of transparency around the
तो जी व्यूवर, ये थी वीडियो और आपने देखा कि बांग्लादेश के जो आंकड़े हैं वो बहुत ही जबरदस्त हैं, जो फिगर हैं वो बहुत जबरदस्त हैं और आने वाले टाइम पे बांग्लादेश एक बड़ी इकोनॉमी बनने जा रहा है। बांग्लादेश की ये बड़ी कामयाबी है कि आलमी मार्केट के अंदर चीन को टक्कर दे रहा है बांग्लादेश, और चाइना को टक्कर देना जरा भी इजी नहीं है बांग्लादेश के लिए, लेकिन बहुत ही बड़ा एक कंट्री है चीन, बड़ी एक मईशत है, बड़ी एक मार्केट है जिसको डैमेज कर रहा है बांग्लादेश। और आलमी माहिरीन का यह कहना है कि आने वाले चंद सालों में बांग्लादेश की इकोनॉमी चीन से भी बड़ी बन जाएगी। 2023 के अंदर बांग्लादेश ने चीन से भी ज्यादा एक्सपोर्ट की है, तो ये बांग्लादेश की बड़ी कामयाबी है और आने वाले चंद सालों में बांग्लादेश दुनिया के अंदर अपना एक मकाम बना चुका होगा, अपना एक लेबल बना चुका होगा जिसमें नंबर 1 कंट्री बन जाएगा बांग्लादेश। और ये बांग्लादेश की बड़ी कामयाबी होगी जिसका मुकाबला चीन के साथ है। तो ये बांग्लादेश की बड़ी कामयाबी है, बांग्लादेशियों की मेहनत है कि आज बांग्लादेश चीन जैसी कंट्री को भी टक्कर दे रहा है। तो ये थी आज की वीडियो। आप इस तजिए के बारे में, आप इस एंकरों के बारे में क्या कहना चाहते हैं, जरूर कमेंट करके हमें बताइएगा। बहुत शुक्रिया।